The village of Little Abbotswood lay folded into the December countryside like a picture pressed between the pages of a book. Quiet lanes rhymed with frost, hedgerows dusted white, and chimneys breathing out gentle plumes of smoke that curled lazily into the pale winter sky. Christmas had come early that year, or so the villagers said, for there was already a feeling of expectation in the air, bells rehearsing hymns, shop windows glowing with tinsel, and a certain sharpening of curiosity that always accompanied a gathering at Greystone Manor. Greystone Manor stood at the edge of the village, a handsome Georgian house of mellow stone, its tall windows gazing solemnly over lawns now stiff with cold. Inside, the manor was warm, lamplit, and fragrant with pine boughs and beeswax polish. It was here that Mrs. Arabella Fenton, the widowed mistress of Greystone, had insisted upon reviving a long-neglected tradition, the Christmas parlour gathering. The house feels empty without it, she had said firmly, when neighbours gently suggested that such festivities might be too much for a lady of her years, and empty houses invite mischief. Miss Jane Marple, seated now in a comfortable corner of the parlour with her knitting laid neatly in her lap, reflected that Mrs. Fenton was not entirely wrong, though perhaps not in the way she imagined. Houses, like people, collected memories, and memories, when stirred, had a way of bringing uncomfortable truths to the surface. The parlour itself was the heart of Greystone Manor. It was a long, gracious room panelled in dark wood, with a wide hearth at one end and tall French windows at the other, curtained in deep green velvet. Above the mantelpiece hung a large oil portrait of Mr. Fenton, stern-eyed and immaculately whiskered, watching over the room with an expression that suggested he disapproved of most modern habits. The Christmas tree stood near the window, its candles unlit for the moment, decorated with glass ornaments and paper chains that had clearly been brought down from the attic, bearing the gentle wear of many seasons. Miss Marple observed it all with quiet appreciation. She had been invited to stay at Greystone as Mrs. Fenton's guest for the fortnight before Christmas, an invitation she had accepted with polite pleasure. One must keep busy in the winter months, she always said, and a change of scene was beneficial. Besides, village gatherings, wherever they occurred, tended to be remarkably alike. People were people, after all. At present, the parlour contained a small but varied company, each drawn for different reasons by Mrs. Fenton's invitation. Closest to the fire sat Mr. Lionel Harcourt, Mrs. Fenton's nephew, a man in his early 40s with neatly parted hair and an air of mild impatience. He held a glass of sherry loosely in one hand and glanced often towards the clock, as though the evening were an obligation rather than a pleasure. Opposite him, perched rather stiffly on a brocade chair, was Miss Celia Ward, Mrs. Fenton's former companion and secretary. She was a pale woman with sharp features and watchful eyes, dressed in sensible brown tweed. She smiled when spoken to, but her smile never quite reached her eyes. Near the window stood Dr. Edwin Pembroke, the village physician, warming his hands at the fire while discoursing earnestly on the effects of cold weather upon the elderly. His voice carried the comfortable authority of a man accustomed to being listened to. And finally, hovering between chairs with a plate of mince pies balanced precariously in her hands, was Mrs. Violet Crane, a neighbour and enthusiastic amateur organiser of village events. She had already remarked, twice upon, how charming it was to have such a distinguished gathering. At Greystone once more, Miss Marple noted with gentle interest that Mrs. Crane's cheerfulness seemed rather forced. Mrs. Fenton herself entered the parlour at that moment, leaning lightly upon her cane. She was a tall woman, still upright despite her years, with grey hair arranged neatly beneath a lace cap. Her eyes were bright, and there was colour in her cheeks, whether from the warmth of the room or from the satisfaction of seeing her guests assembled. "Ah, Miss Marple," she said warmly, crossing the room, "I trust you're comfortable. You must tell me if the fire is too fierce." "Perfectly comfortable, thank you," Miss Marple replied, her voice mild. One so seldom sees a fire laid properly these days. Mrs. Fenton smiled with approval. "Exactly what I always say." As the evening progressed, conversation flowed in the pleasant, aimless fashion typical of such gatherings. Village news, the state of the roads, speculation about Christmas weather. Miss Marple listened more than she spoke, her needles clicking softly as she worked. She noticed the slight tension beneath the polite exchanges, the way Mr. Harcourt avoided Miss Ward's gaze, the faint edge in Mrs. Fenton's tone when she addressed her nephew, the doctor's curious habit of lowering his voice when speaking to Mrs. Crane. It was, Miss Marple thought, rather like one of those Christmas puddings where the sweetness concealed a surprising number of hard objects. After supper, Mrs. Fenton proposed a return to the parlour for coffee. The servants cleared the table, and the company drifted back to their earlier positions. Outside, darkness had settled over the grounds, and the windows reflected the warm interior like mirrors. It was then that Mrs. Fenton spoke of the house. "You know," she said thoughtfully, settling into her high-backed chair, "there are those who say the parlour is haunted." Mrs. Crane gave a delighted little shiver. "Oh, Arabella, you never told me that." "Nonsense," said Mr. Harcourt sharply. "Greystone isn't haunted." Mrs. Fenton smiled faintly. "No, no, I don't suppose it is. But people talk, as they always do. They say my husband's presence lingers here, especially at Christmas." Miss Marple lifted her eyes. "Indeed, and have you noticed anything yourself?" Mrs. Fenton hesitated, a pause just long enough to be remarked. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "I feel watched, as though the house remembers more than it ought." Miss Ward shifted in her seat. "Ghost stories do tend to flourish when houses are old and memories inconvenient." The words fell rather heavily into the room. A silence followed, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Mrs. Fenton laughed lightly. "Well, we shall not let fancies spoil our Christmas. Tomorrow evening I propose we light the tree candles here in the parlour, just as we did in years past." Mr. Harcourt frowned. "Is that wise, with all those old decorations?" "Nonsense," said his aunt briskly. "I have lived here 40 years. I know my own house." Miss Marple's gaze drifted almost idly to the portrait above the mantelpiece. Mr. Fenton's painted eyes seemed to follow the company with unblinking attention. That night the household retired early. Miss Marple slept soundly in her guest-room, lulled by the quiet of the countryside and the reassuring solidity of the manor. It was therefore with some surprise that she was awakened the next morning by hurried footsteps in the corridor and a sharp knock at her door. "Miss Marple, oh, Miss Marple, I do hope you're awake." It was Miss Ward's voice, tight with strain. Miss Marple opened the door to find her pale and trembling. "Whatever is the matter, my dear?" "It's Mrs. Fenton," Miss Ward whispered. "She's been found in the parlour." The parlour was very still. Daylight filtered weakly through the tall windows, illuminating the Christmas tree, now dark and unlit, its ornaments glinting faintly. Mrs. Fenton lay at the foot of her chair, her cane fallen beside her. At first glance, it looked as though she had simply slipped, an unfortunate accident, perhaps brought on by the cold. But Miss Marple noticed the way the chair had been shifted slightly, the untouched cup of coffee on the side table, and the faint, almost imperceptible smell of bitter almonds lingering in the warm air. Dr. Pembroke stood nearby, his face grave. "I'm afraid she's been dead several hours." Mr. Harcourt stared down at his aunt's body, shock and something else flickering across his features. Miss Marple folded her hands together, her expression one of quiet concern. "Accidents," she murmured softly, "are very often not what they seem." Outside, the church bells began to ring, calling the village to a Christmas season that would, in Little Abbotswood, be remembered for very different reasons. The news spread through Little Abbotswood with the peculiar speed that only village news could achieve, faster than the post, and with considerably more embellishment. By noon, every shopkeeper, parishioner, and passer by knew that Mrs. Arabella Fenton was dead, and that her death had occurred not quietly in her bed, but dramatically in the very parlour where she had entertained her guests the previous evening. Greystone Manor, once warm with anticipation of Christmas, had taken on a hushed, uneasy atmosphere. Curtains were drawn, fires burned low, and servants moved about with subdued efficiency, speaking in whispers. The Christmas tree remained where it stood, a mute and slightly accusing presence. Miss Marple sat near the window, her knitting in her lap though she did not stitch. She had found over the years that people were far more inclined to speak freely when one appeared to be otherwise occupied. Dr. Pembroke had completed his initial examination and now addressed the small assembled group with professional gravity. "There are no obvious signs of violence," he said. "However, given the circumstances, and Mrs. Fenton's excellent health, I have informed the police. An inquest will, of course, be necessary." Mr. Lionel Harcourt reacted sharply. "An inquest? Surely that's unnecessary. My aunt was not a young woman." "No," said the doctor calmly, but she was not one to collapse without cause. Miss Celia Ward stood rigid by the mantelpiece. "You mentioned a smell," she said quietly. "Almonds." Dr. Pembroke hesitated. "Yes, faint, but present. It may mean nothing, but it may mean something." Miss Marple allowed her needles to rest. "One so often finds," she said gently, "that faint things matter very much indeed." The police arrived shortly after luncheon in the form of Inspector Harold Finch, a solid, courteous man with a notebook that never seemed far from his hand. He listened attentively as Dr. Pembroke summarized his findings, nodding now and again. "I don't want to alarm anyone," Inspector Finch said at last, "but until we know more, I must treat this as suspicious." Mrs. Violet Crane clasped her hands together. "How dreadful! Just before Christmas, too." Inspector Finch turned to her. "You were here last night, madame?" "Yes, yes, of course, we all were." "Could you tell me when you last saw Mrs. Fenton alive?" Mrs. Crane thought carefully. "After supper in the parlour. She was in excellent spirits, quite determined about lighting the tree candles this evening." Inspector Finch made a note, and after that, "Well, we all retired. Nothing unusual, I assure you." Miss Marple watched as the inspector spoke to each of them in turn, his questions polite but persistent. Mr. Harcourt was brisk, almost defensive. Miss Ward answered carefully, as though each word had been weighed before leaving her lips. Dr. Pembroke remained professional, though Miss Marple noted a faint crease between his brows that had not been there the night before. When at last the inspector turned to her, Miss Marple looked up with mild surprise. "And you, Miss Marple," she supplied, "Jane Marple, you're staying here as a guest, yes. Did you observe anything out of the ordinary last night?" Miss Marple considered. "Only that people are rarely as ordinary as they believe themselves to be." Inspector Finch smiled faintly. "Indeed, but did you hear anything, see anything?" "No," said Miss Marple, "but then, one does not always need to." The inspector looked puzzled, but he thanked her politely and moved on. Later that afternoon, the body was removed discreetly, and the parlour closed off. Mrs. Fenton's death hung over the house like a heavy curtain, dimming every conversation. Miss Marple took tea in her room, reflecting quietly. It was tempting, very tempting, to see Mrs. Fenton's death as a simple matter of age and accident. But the details did not sit comfortably. The untouched coffee, the scent of almonds, and most of all the timing. That evening Miss Ward came to her door. "Miss Marple," she said hesitantly, "you have experience of people. I wondered, might I speak with you?" "Of course, my dear, come in." Miss Ward sat stiffly, clasping her hands together. Mrs. Fenton was not always easy, but she was fair. She intended to change her will. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows slightly. "Did she tell you this herself?" "Yes, only a week ago." "And who stood to gain?" Miss Ward hesitated. "Mr. Harcourt, primarily, but Mrs. Fenton had grown, disappointed in him. Disappointed, Miss Marple prompted gently. She believed he had mismanaged money she had entrusted to him. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "How unfortunate!" Miss Ward rose abruptly. "I should not have said anything, but people should know she was not careless with her affairs." After she had gone, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. Money, she reflected, was a remarkably reliable motive, especially at Christmas, when expectations ran high. The next morning Miss Marple encountered Mr. Harcourt in the library. He was pacing restlessly, papers spread across the desk. "A dreadful business," he said abruptly, as though compelled to speak. "My aunt was stubborn, but she did not deserve this. Few people do." Miss Marple replied mildly. He hesitated. "You knew her only briefly. You cannot know what she was like." Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, but one can know a great deal in a short time, especially when one listens." His mouth tightened. "You imply—" "I imply nothing," she said gently. "I merely observe. He left shortly thereafter, clearly unsettled." Miss Marple made her way downstairs and encountered Mrs. Crane hovering near the servants' corridor. "Miss Marple," she exclaimed, "such a terrible shock, and just when the village fete committee was relying on Mrs. Fenton's donation." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "Oh yes, she promised a generous sum, but now, well, everything is uncertain." "Uncertainty," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "does make people anxious." Mrs. Crane laughed nervously. "We must hope the police resolve matters quickly." Later that day, Inspector Finch returned, this time accompanied by a young constable. He requested access to the parlour. Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance, lingering near the doorway as the inspector examined the room. He paused by the side table. "The coffee cup," he murmured. "Still here?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "It was not touched." Inspector Finch glanced at her. "You noticed that. One notices many things in drawing-rooms," she replied serenely. The inspector bent to examine the chair. "It's been moved." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "just slightly." Inspector Finch straightened. "You have an observant eye, Miss Marple." "I knit," she said. "It trains one to see small irregularities." As the afternoon wore on, the village buzzed with speculation. Some whispered of a ghostly presence, recalling Mrs. Fenton's words the night before her death. Others spoke more pragmatically of inheritance and grievances. That evening, as Miss Marple sat by the fire, she reflected upon the notion of haunting. Houses did not haunt people, she believed. People haunted one another, with memories, resentments, and unspoken truths. The parlour, once a place of warmth and tradition, had become a silent witness, and witnesses, Miss Marple knew, often told their stories not through what was present, but through what was missing. Outside, snow began to fall softly, blanketing little Abbotswood in white. Christmas approached inexorably, bringing with it goodwill, tradition, and sometimes the reckoning of long, buried wrongs. Miss Marple folded her knitting with quiet resolve. This was no accident, and she had only just begun to understand why. Snow transformed little Abbotswood overnight, softening edges and muting sound, as though the village itself had agreed to speak in whispers. The hedgerows bowed beneath their white burden, and the narrow lane leading to Greystone Manor lay pristine and undisturbed save for a single set of tyre tracks made early that morning. Miss Marple noticed them from the window as she took her tea. One set only. Someone had come and gone before the household stirred. She stored the observation away carefully. By mid-morning, Inspector Finch returned once more, his manner more purposeful than before. He requested that all those present at the Christmas gathering remain available for further questioning. "I don't believe anyone is going anywhere," Mrs. Crane said briskly, though her eyes darted towards the door. "Not in weather like this." The inspector began with Miss Celia Ward. They sat together in the small morning room, the curtains half drawn against the glare of snow. Miss Marple, invited to remain on the pretext of companionship, sat quietly to one side. Miss Ward folded her hands tightly in her lap. "I was Mrs. Fenton's companion for nearly 12 years, she said. "I managed her correspondence, her accounts, her household schedules, and her will," Inspector Finch asked. Miss Ward hesitated. "I typed earlier versions, yes, but the most recent, she wished to revise it personally." "Why?" Miss Ward swallowed. She believed someone close to her had betrayed her trust. Inspector Finch glanced at his notebook. Did she say who? No, but she was deeply upset. After Miss Ward left, Inspector Finch rubbed his chin. "She had opportunity," he said, "access to everything Mrs. Fenton consumed." "Access," said Miss Marple gently, "is not always the same as inclination." "True, but bitterness can be a powerful spur." Miss Marple thought of the way Miss Ward had spoken, not angrily, but with a contained intensity, like water held behind a dam. Mr. Lionel Harcourt's interview followed. He was less composed. "This is absurd," he snapped. "I had no reason to harm my aunt." "Your aunt intended to change her will," Inspector Finch said calmly. Mr. Harcourt's face reddened. "That is unproven. She told others," Finch replied. Harcourt laughed harshly. "My aunt was prone to suspicions. She imagined slights where none existed." "And the money she entrusted to you?" Finch pressed. Harcourt's voice rose. "Investments, perfectly legitimate. Markets fluctuate." Miss Marple interjected softly. "They do, but people do not always appreciate fluctuation when it affects their Christmas plans." Harcourt glared at her. "You're suggesting—" "I am suggesting nothing," Miss Marple replied serenely, merely observing. He stormed out soon after, leaving the room vibrating with his agitation. Dr. Pembroke's interview was quieter. "I left shortly after 10, he said. "I examined Mrs. Fenton earlier in the day. She was well, no sign of heart trouble, and after supper Finch asked. I had a night call, Mrs. Bellows in the village." Miss Marple lifted her head slightly. "Mrs. Bellows, the one with chronic bronchitis?" "Yes. How fortunate she became ill when she did," Miss Marple murmured. Dr. Pembroke stiffened. "Are you implying—" "Only that coincidence often pretends to be convenience." Inspector Finch scribbled briskly. Later that day, a new development unsettled the household. One of the maids, pale and flustered, brought Inspector Finch a small bottle found in the drawer of a side table in the parlour. "It wasn't there before," she insisted. "At least I never saw it." The label was faded but legible. "Laurel essence." Dr. Pembroke examined it gravely. "Contains cyanogenic compounds. Ingestion could produce a faint almond smell." Mrs. Crane gasped. "Poison." Inspector Finch nodded, which means Mrs. Fenton did not simply fall. Eyes turned instinctively towards Miss Ward. She flushed. "I've never seen that bottle before." "Nor I," said Harcourt sharply. Miss Marple picked up the bottle, peering at it thoughtfully. "Such a curious place to keep it," she said. "One usually stores medicines, or poisons, somewhere more private." Inspector Finch frowned. "You think it was planted?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that whoever placed it there wanted it to be found." Suspicion now seeped into every corner of Greystone Manor. Servants whispered. Doors closed quietly. The parlour, once a place of warmth, became a symbol of dread. That night Miss Marple was awakened once more, this time by a sound from below, soft footsteps, a door opening. She rose quietly, wrapping a shawl about her shoulders, and peered into the corridor. A figure moved at the far end, slipping into the stairwell. Miss Marple waited a moment, then followed at a discreet distance. The figure entered the parlour. Miss Marple paused in the doorway. Moonlight silvered the room. The figure bent near the mantelpiece, reaching up, looking for something. Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Crane whirled around, clutching at her chest. "Miss Marple, you frightened me. Forgive me," said Miss Marple. "I couldn't sleep." Mrs. Crane forced a laugh. "Nor could I. I thought I'd fetch a book." "At the mantelpiece?" Miss Marple asked mildly. Mrs. Crane flushed. "I dropped a letter there earlier." Miss Marple said nothing, merely watching as Mrs. Crane hurried away. The next morning brought another revelation. Miss Ward requested to see Miss Marple privately. "I cannot bear this any longer," she said, tears welling. "Mrs. Fenton confided in me. She feared someone was poisoning her gradually, making her weak, confused." "Who did she suspect?" Miss Marple asked. Miss Ward shook her head. She did not say, but she planned to expose them after Christmas. Miss Marple nodded slowly, a dangerous intention. Later that day, Inspector Finch received confirmation from the laboratory: cyanide poisoning. Enough to kill swiftly if administered in coffee. The method was now clear, the culprit less so. Every suspect had motive. Every suspect had opportunity. Miss Marple sat alone in the parlour that evening, gazing at the chair where Mrs. Fenton had died. The Christmas tree loomed nearby, its unlit candles like silent witnesses. A thought crystallized in her mind, not about who could have done it, but about who would have chosen this room, this moment, and this carefully staged atmosphere of haunting. She smiled faintly. "Ghosts," she murmured, "are so often a convenient disguise." And at that moment a sudden knock at the door shattered the quiet. Inspector Finch stood there, grave, faced Miss Marple. He said, "There's been another incident." Inspector Finch led Miss Marple briskly down the corridor towards the east wing of Greystone Manor. His expression was grave, but there was a flicker of something else there too, relief, perhaps, at having someone beside him who did not ask foolish questions. "It's Miss Ward," he said in a low voice. She collapsed in her room, unconscious but alive. Miss Marple stopped walking. Collapsed how? Empty glass beside the bed. Bitter smell again. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "Then someone wishes us to believe that Miss Ward attempted suicide." "That's how it looks." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but looking and seeing are not the same thing." Miss Ward lay pale against the pillows, her breathing shallow but steady. Dr. Pembroke hovered nearby, fussing with blankets and murmuring instructions to a nurse. "She will recover," he said shortly. The dose was not fatal. Miss Marple approached the bedside. Was it Miss Ward who called for help? "No," said the nurse. Mrs. Crane found her. Miss Marple's eyes flickered just for a moment. "How fortunate," she murmured. Inspector Finch frowned. "You think this was staged?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that whoever poisoned Mrs. Fenton now wishes very much to divert attention." She bent closer, noting the position of the glass, the faint smear on its rim. "Miss Ward is right-handed, is she not?" "Yes," Finch replied. "The glass is positioned for a left-handed drinker." Inspector Finch exhaled slowly. "So someone put it there, or handed it to her," Miss Marple said quietly. The house seemed to hold its breath. By afternoon the mood had shifted. Fear sharpened into suspicion. The servants were interviewed again. The suspects avoided one another entirely. Greystone Manor no longer felt haunted. It felt hunted. Miss Marple requested tea in the parlour. Inspector Finch joined her, perching awkwardly on the edge of a chair, notebook in hand. "You've something on your mind," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Several things, in fact. and they all insist upon being considered together. She gazed around the room. The timing of Mrs. Fenton's death was theatrical, the talk of ghosts the night before, the location, and then, most telling of all, the poison, the laurel essence. Finch said, anyone could have obtained it. Could they? Miss Marple asked gently. It is not something commonly kept in households, but it is something an enthusiastic organizer of village fetes might use. Holly, ivy, laurel wreaths. Inspector Finch's eyes narrowed. Mrs. Crane, she had access to the house. Miss Marple continued, and a reason to fear Mrs. Fenton's intentions. If Mrs. Fenton withdrew her donation, or altered her will, the fate committee would collapse, and Mrs. Crane's influence along with it. But that's not murder, Finch said. No, Miss Marple agreed, but ambition often dresses itself as necessity. They were interrupted by Dr. Pembroke, who entered briskly. I must insist upon clarity. He said stiffly, there are whispers. I will not have my reputation damaged by village gossip. Miss Marple looked at him kindly. Then you should welcome truth, Doctor. His lips tightened. You were called out on the night of Mrs. Fenton's death. Miss Marple said to Mrs. Bellows, yes, and yet Mrs. Bellows insists she never sent for you. Silence fell like snow. Inspector Finch turned sharply. Is that true? Dr. Pembroke coloured. She may not remember. She's elderly. She remembers very well. Miss Marple said gently. She remembers sitting up with her cough alone. Dr. Pembroke's composure cracked. I was concerned about Mrs. Fenton, he said abruptly. She had been complaining of headaches, confusion, poisoning symptoms. Miss Marple said softly, you suspected someone else. Finch asked. I suspected Miss Ward. Pembroke snapped. She controlled the household, the food, and yet, Miss Marple said, you did not warn Mrs. Fenton, nor the police. Pembroke said nothing. Miss Marple rose. Doctor, when people fear exposure, they often act rashly. Later that evening, Miss Marple gathered her thoughts carefully. She sent a message through the inspector requesting that all remaining suspects assemble in the parlour the following evening. For what purpose? Finch asked. For Christmas, Miss Marple replied. Of a sort. The next evening candles were lit. The Christmas tree glowed softly for the first time since Mrs. Fenton's death. The room felt almost unchanged, almost. Mr. Harcourt arrived last, his face drawn. This is madness, he muttered. We should not be here. Miss Marple smiled at him kindly. Truth does not fear company. She turned to the group. Mrs. Fenton believed this room was haunted. She was quite right. Mrs. Crane gave a nervous laugh. Really, Miss Marple, by memory, Miss Marple continued, by guilt and by deception. She picked up the small laurel bottle from the table. This poison was used twice, or nearly so, but only one of those attempts was intended to kill. She turned to Miss Ward. Yours was meant to convince us you were guilty. Miss Ward gasped. I would never, and you didn't. Miss Marple said gently. She turned slowly, deliberately, to Mrs. Violet Crane. You had motive, access, knowledge of decorative compounds, and most importantly, you found both victims. Mrs. Crane's smile trembled. I was only trying to help. You were trying to protect your standing. Miss Marple said. Mrs. Fenton intended to withdraw her support. You knew it. Inspector Finch stepped forward. Mrs. Crane, but Miss Marple raised a hand. One thing remains. Why the chair? The chair, Finch echoed, to suggest a fall. Miss Marple said, an accident, but Mrs. Fenton never drank coffee in that chair, only sherry. Mrs. Crane's face drained of colour. You forgot, Miss Marple said softly, because you were thinking of effect, not habit. Mrs. Crane collapsed into a chair, sobbing. I only meant to frighten her, she cried. She fell when I moved the chair. Miss Marple shook her head sadly. Poison does not frighten, it kills. Inspector Finch signalled to the constable. As Mrs. Crane was led away, the parlour felt suddenly lighter. Miss Marple looked at the glowing tree. "Christmas," she murmured, "is a season of truth, whether we welcome it or not." The removal of Mrs. Violet Crane from Greystone Manor was conducted with quiet efficiency. There were no dramatic outbursts, no last-minute protests, only a dazed silence and the unmistakable sound of handcuffs clicking shut. The Christmas candles continued to burn as she was led from the room, their steady glow an almost reproachful contrast to the disorder she left behind. When the door finally closed, the parlour seemed to exhale. Mr. Lionel Harcourt sank into a chair, rubbing his forehead. "I still can't quite believe it." Dr. Pembroke stood stiffly by the mantelpiece, his face pale. Miss Ward remained very still, her hands folded in her lap, as though afraid that any movement might disturb the fragile calm. Inspector Finch cleared his throat. "Miss Marple, I'd like, if you would, to go over it once more, for the record." "Of course," said Miss Marple, settling herself comfortably. "It is always best to put things in order. Disorder, after all, is what causes trouble in the first place." She glanced around the room, ensuring that everyone present was listening, not merely hearing. Mrs. Fenton, Miss Marple began, was a woman of strong habits and long memory. Such people notice when things change. In recent weeks she had begun to feel unwell, headaches, confusion, moments of weakness. She suspected, quite rightly, that something was amiss. Miss Ward nodded faintly. "She told me she felt she was being managed." "Exactly," said Miss Marple, "and that frightened her. She resolved to set her affairs in order, to revise her will, to withdraw certain promises, and to confront those who relied upon her generosity without gratitude." Mr. Harcourt shifted uncomfortably. "It is natural," Miss Marple continued gently, "to look first at those closest to the victim. A nephew with financial worries, a secretary with access, a doctor with knowledge, all very neat, all very tempting." Inspector Finch nodded. "Red herrings, indeed, but Mrs. Crane," Miss Marple said softly, "was something else entirely. Mrs. Crane, she explained, had built her influence in Little Abbotswood upon organization and goodwill. Committees depended on her, events revolved around her, and at the centre of many of those plans stood Mrs. Fenton's financial support. When Mrs. Fenton decided to withdraw that support, Miss Marple said Mrs. Crane's carefully maintained position was threatened, not just embarrassed. Dr. Pembroke frowned, but she claimed she only meant to frighten Mrs. Fenton. Miss Marple shook her head. "That is a lie people often tell themselves. Mrs. Crane had already begun administering small doses of laurel essence, enough to weaken Mrs. Fenton to make her doubt herself. That alone is an act of quiet cruelty." Miss Ward covered her mouth with her hand. "On the night of the gathering," Miss Marple continued, "Mrs. Crane took advantage of atmosphere, ghost stories, candlelight, memory. She added a fatal dose to the coffee. But the fall?" Inspector Finch asked. "A performance," said Miss Marple. "Mrs. Crane moved the chair to suggest an accident. She relied upon assumptions. That age explains everything, that Christmas invites indulgence, that people prefer comfort to truth." Mr. Harcourt looked sick. "And Miss Ward, her collapse," Miss Marple said, "was a deliberate imitation. Mrs. Crane wished to point suspicion away from herself. She arranged the glass incorrectly, left-handed placement for a right-handed woman, because she was careless in panic." Dr. Pembroke stared at the floor. "And my involvement?" Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "You suspected poisoning, Doctor, but you feared the consequences of being wrong, so you remained silent. Silence, I'm afraid, often assists guilt." He bowed his head. Inspector Finch closed his notebook. "That will be sufficient." The official business concluded shortly thereafter. Statements were taken, arrangements made. The household was allowed at last to disperse. Snow fell again that night, soft and forgiving, covering the footprints of the past days. Aftermath Christmas morning dawned cold but bright. The bells of Little Abbots Wood rang out clearly across the fields, and smoke rose once more from Greystone Manor's chimneys. Miss Ward entered the parlour quietly, carrying a tray of tea. I thought, she said hesitantly, that perhaps we might still light the candles. Miss Marple smiled. I think Mrs. Fenton would have liked that. Together they lit the tree. The candles flickered into life, reflecting in the window panes and casting gentle shadows across the room. The parlour no longer felt oppressive. The portrait above the mantelpiece seemed, if anything, less severe. Mr. Harcourt joined them, awkward but sincere. I intend to remain here for a time, he said, to put things right. That, said Miss Marple pleasantly, is always a good beginning. Dr. Pembroke sent a note later that day, formally apologizing for his silence and promising greater vigilance in future. Miss Marple suspected he would keep his word. Public humility had a way of encouraging private reform. As for Miss Ward, arrangements were made for her to remain at Greystone Manor as its caretaker. It was, Miss Marple thought, a fitting outcome. Loyalty, when untainted by resentment, deserved a home. A quiet Christmas reflection on Christmas evening, Miss Marple sat once more in her favourite chair, knitting resting in her lap. The fire burned steadily. Outside, the snow gleamed faintly beneath the moon. Inspector Finch had called earlier to say his goodbyes. I hope, he said, that this won't discourage you from visiting country houses in future. Miss Marple smiled. On the contrary, they are most instructive places. Now, alone with her thoughts, she reflected upon the notion of haunting. Greystone Manor was no longer haunted by suspicion or fear, but it would always remember, just as villages do and people do. Memory, Miss Marple believed, was not something to be feared, only ignored. She looked at the Christmas tree, its candles nearly burned down, and murmured softly, "Peace on earth requires honesty first." The bells rang again in the distance. Christmas had returned to Little Abbots Wood, and Greystone Manor, at last, was at rest.